Jacob's story begins even before his birth, reminding us that God's plans and purposes often precede our very existence. He was the son of Isaac and Rebekah, and the grandson of Abraham, the patriarch with whom God had made an eternal covenant. This covenant was a divine promise that Abraham's descendants would become a great nation, blessed by God to be a blessing to all peoples. But the fulfillment of this promise was not automatic or easy. It required faith, patience, and often mysterious and difficult circumstances. Isaac and Rebekah faced such a trial. Rebekah was barren, unable to conceive a child. In those times, barrenness was a heavy burden, often associated with shame or despair. Isaac's response was prayer, an act of faith and surrender. When God answered and Rebekah became pregnant, the couple did not just rejoice, they noticed something extraordinary. Inside Rebekah's womb, there was a struggle, a wrestling, a conflict. This prenatal battle symbolized the spiritual and earthly battles ahead, and when Rebekah sought God for understanding, she received a profound revelation. Two nations are in your womb. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. This prophecy set the stage for a dramatic reversal of expectations and showed us that God's ways are often contrary to human traditions and assumptions. God was already shaping the future of nations through the life of a child still in the womb. The moment of Jacob and Esau's birth reveals much about destiny and God's sovereignty over human history. The firstborn, Esau, came out hairy, red, and robust, a symbol of strength and vigor, destined to be a hunter and a man of the field. Then Jacob was born, holding his brother's heel, a sign both literal and symbolic. This act of grasping the heel is often interpreted as Jacob's early desire to supplant or overcome his brother, hinting at his determined and sometimes cunning nature. His name itself, Jacob, can mean heel grabber or supplanter, foreshadowing his future struggles and the challenges he would face to claim God's blessing. But beyond the personality traits, the story reveals a deeper spiritual truth. The divine election of Jacob over Esau was not based on human merit or the order of birth, but on God's sovereign choice. This choice caused a split in the family. Esau became Isaac's favorite, embodying the rugged, outward lifestyle of a hunter, while Jacob was Rebekah's favored child, quiet and reflective, more inclined to home and family. This division sowed the seeds for conflict, but also illustrated how human preferences and affections can clash with God's divine purposes. The story of Esau selling his birthright to Jacob is a poignant moment packed with lessons about priorities, values, and the cost of choices. Esau returned from the field exhausted and famished, and found Jacob cooking a stew. In a moment of weakness and impatience, Esau asked for some food, and Jacob, seizing the opportunity, proposed an extraordinary trade. The stew for Esau's birthright, the special rights and blessings belonging to the firstborn son. This birthright was more than just inheritance. It included spiritual leadership and God's covenant blessings. Esau's impulsive decision to trade away something eternal for momentary satisfaction shows how easy it is to undervalue what truly matters. Many people live like Esau, prioritizing temporary pleasures or immediate relief over God's long-term promises. Jacob's actions, while opportunistic, reveal a hunger and determination to possess God's blessing, a thirst that, despite his flaws, God honored and used to fulfill his plan. This story invites us to examine our own lives. Are we like Esau, careless with spiritual blessings? Or do we, like Jacob, pursue God's promises, though sometimes imperfectly, with persistence? Ultimately, God's grace works through our weaknesses to bring about his purposes. As Isaac grew old and his eyesight failed, the time came for him to give the blessing that belonged to the firstborn son. This blessing was not merely a parental good wish. It was a sacred covenantal act with lasting spiritual and material consequences. Rebekah, aware of God's earlier revelation about her sons, feared that Esau would receive the blessing and that God's promise would be jeopardized. So she devised a plan for Jacob to receive it instead. This plan involved deception. Rebekah prepared a meal for Isaac and dressed Jacob in Esau's clothes, covering his hands and neck with goat skins to mimic Esau's hairy skin. Jacob was hesitant, but ultimately obeyed his mother's instructions. When Isaac, blind and old, blessed Jacob, he did so believing he was blessing Esau, unknowingly passing the covenant to the younger son. This event reveals the messy, complicated reality of God's work through imperfect people and imperfect circumstances. It reminds us that God's promises are not limited by human failings or schemes, though these bring consequences and pain. It also raises difficult questions about honesty, trust, and family dynamics. Yet the story shows that God's sovereignty and grace prevail even in human deception. When Esau discovered what had happened, his reaction was one of rage and despair. He felt betrayed by his brother and father and vowed to kill Jacob. This threat forced Jacob to flee for his life, sent away by his mother to her brother Laban's home in Haran. This exile was more than just physical. It marked the beginning of a long journey of growth, struggle, and transformation for Jacob. Sometimes God allows or causes us to leave familiar places and comforts to grow in faith and character. In the wilderness of exile, we encounter God in new ways, face our fears, and learn to trust Him more deeply. Jacob's flight was not a shameful escape, but a necessary step toward fulfilling his destiny. It also reminds us that consequences follow our choices, and sometimes faithfulness requires sacrifice and stepping into the unknown. Alone and vulnerable on his journey, Jacob stopped for the night and used a stone as a pillow. In a dream, he saw a ladder or staircase stretching from earth to heaven, with angels ascending and descending upon it. At the top stood the Lord, who spoke to Jacob directly, reaffirming the covenant God made with Abraham and Isaac. God promised to give Jacob and his descendants the land on which he lay, and assured him of his presence and protection wherever he went. This dream was a powerful encounter with the divine and a turning point in Jacob's life. It showed Jacob that, despite his flaws and fears, God was with him. This vision also symbolizes the connection between heaven and earth, and it points forward to Jesus Christ, who would later be revealed as the ultimate bridge between God and humanity. Jacob woke up filled with awe and declared the place holy, naming it Bethel, meaning house of God. He made a vow to worship and serve God faithfully. This story teaches us that God meets us in unexpected places, often when we feel most alone or afraid, and invites us into a personal relationship with Him. It encourages us to recognize and honor God's presence in our daily lives and to commit ourselves to His promises. When Jacob arrived in Haran, he immediately encountered Rachel, the daughter of his uncle Laban. The moment was filled with deep emotion and longing, as Jacob fell in love with Rachel at first sight. This instant love symbolizes how sometimes God prepares moments of joy and hope amid uncertainty and exile. Jacob asked Laban for Rachel's hand in marriage, and Laban agreed, but with a condition. Jacob would have to serve him for 7 years as a bride price. This agreement shows the value placed on marriage and commitment in those times, and also reflects the cost of pursuing what we desire. Jacob's willingness to work hard for 7 years demonstrates perseverance and devotion, but it also foreshadows the challenges ahead. The 7 years passed quickly for Jacob because of his love for Rachel, reminding us that love can give us strength and motivation even in difficult situations. However, on the wedding night, Laban deceived Jacob by giving him Leah, Rachel's older sister, instead of Rachel. This cruel trick was a huge disappointment for Jacob and a painful blow to his hopes and dreams. Laban justified his action by explaining the local custom that the older daughter must marry before the younger. Yet, he promised that Jacob could also marry Rachel if he agreed to serve another 7 years. Jacob accepted, demonstrating his commitment, but also the complexity of family and cultural dynamics. This deception introduced tension and rivalry between the two sisters, who became Jacob's wives, and marked the beginning of a complicated and emotionally charged family life. Leah, feeling rejected, sought to win Jacob's affection by bearing many children, while Rachel, loved but initially barren, experienced deep envy. These struggles reflect the pain and brokenness that often accompany human relationships and the longing for acceptance and love. Over the next 20 years, Jacob lived and worked under Laban's authority, enduring deception and hardship. Despite these difficulties, God blessed Jacob abundantly. His flocks and wealth increased, and his family grew with many children. This period in Jacob's life teaches us about God's faithfulness even in the midst of trials. It also reveals the importance of perseverance, trust, and integrity. Though Jacob faced exploitation and injustice, he remained faithful to God's calling and promises. When God finally told Jacob to return to his homeland, Jacob obeyed despite fear and uncertainty. Returning home meant facing the brother he had wronged and the consequences of his past. But it was also an opportunity for healing, reconciliation, and the fulfillment of God's plan. Jacob's story reminds us that God's blessings often come through seasons of difficulty, and that obedience to God requires courage. As Jacob prepared to return to his homeland, the weight of his past actions and fears about reuniting with Esau pressed heavily on him. He sent messengers ahead, bearing gifts of livestock and valuables, hoping to appease his brother's anger and avoid conflict. Jacob also strategically divided his family and possessions into separate groups, aiming to protect them in case of an attack. This careful planning shows his human side, his fears, his sense of responsibility, and his attempt to control a situation that felt dangerous. For the meeting with Esau, Jacob sought something far more important than gifts or strategies. He sought God. Alone during the night, he wrestled with a mysterious figure, an angel or even God himself in human form. This intense, all-night struggle was more than a physical contest. It was a spiritual battle. Jacob was wrestling with his fears, guilt, and his identity. Despite being injured, he refused to let go until he received a blessing. This moment reveals the persistence and faith required to face our own inner struggles and to seek God's transformation. After the long struggle, Jacob received a new name from God, Israel, meaning he struggles with God, or God prevails. This new name marked a turning point, no longer just a man trying to outsmart others or grasp blessings through his own efforts. Jacob was now one who had encountered God directly and was transformed by the experience. This name change symbolizes a new identity, a new purpose, and a deeper relationship with God. It also reminds us that spiritual growth often comes through wrestling with life's challenges, confronting our weaknesses, and relying on God's strength. Jacob left the encounter physically wounded, limping because of a dislocated hip, but spiritually renewed. Sometimes God allows us to be wounded in our journey, not to harm us, but to refine and restore us. The pain becomes a mark of grace and a testimony of God's work in our lives. The next day, when Esau finally appeared with 400 men, Jacob expected the worst. But instead of revenge, Esau ran to embrace his brother, wept, and forgave him. This unexpected act of grace and reconciliation broke the cycle of family conflict and fear. It showed that the wounds of the past could be healed and relationships restored through forgiveness. This reunion is a powerful lesson on the power of grace to overcome bitterness, resentment, and division. Many of us carry burdens from broken relationships or past hurts, but Jacob's story encourages us to seek healing and reconciliation wherever possible. God's plan was bigger than human mistakes and misunderstandings. He was working to bring peace and unity, even where there had been conflict. After the emotional reunion with Esau, Jacob settled back in the land of Canaan, the land promised by God to his grandfather Abraham and father Isaac. Life continued with its joys and sorrows. One of the greatest joys was the birth of Benjamin, the youngest son of Jacob and Rachel. Rachel had struggled deeply with infertility, and Benjamin's birth was a profound blessing, a symbol of hope and renewal after years of longing and disappointment. This reminds us that God's timing is perfect, even when we face seasons of waiting and pain. Patience and faith can lead to new beginnings and unexpected blessings. But life was not without hardship. Rachel died giving birth to Benjamin, a heartbreaking moment that brought sorrow and loss to Jacob's family. Her death marked the end of an era and was a reminder that even God's chosen people experience grief. It teaches us that pain and loss are part of the human experience, and faith does not exempt us from suffering. Yet, through mourning and tears, God's presence remains, comforting and sustaining us. One of the most intense trials came when Jacob believed his beloved son Joseph had been killed by wild animals. In reality, Joseph had been sold into slavery by his own jealous brothers, but for many years Jacob carried the unbearable weight of grief and guilt, mourning as a father who thought he had lost his child forever. This period of suffering shows the depth of human emotion and the complexities within family dynamics, jealousy, betrayal, and reconciliation. It also demonstrates the faithfulness of God, who was orchestrating a greater plan beyond human understanding. In the darkest moments, God's purposes continue to unfold, teaching us trust and hope amid uncertainty. Years later, during a severe famine in Canaan, Jacob learned the astonishing news that Joseph was alive and had risen to power as the governor of Egypt. This revelation was an incredible moment of joy and restoration after years of pain and separation. It showed how God's providence can turn tragedy into triumph, and that his plans are often beyond what we can imagine. Jacob's journey from despair to hope encourages us never to lose faith, even when circumstances seem hopeless. God is always working behind the scenes, preparing the way for redemption and blessing. Moved by this news, Jacob traveled to Egypt with his entire family. The reunion with Joseph was emotional and filled with gratitude. Jacob blessed Joseph's two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, adopting them as his own and securing their place in the family inheritance. This act symbolized the expansion of God's promise to include not only Jacob's immediate children, but future generations as well. It teaches us about the importance of legacy and the ways God's blessings extend through families and communities. Before his death, Jacob blessed each of his 12 sons individually, prophesying about the future tribes of Israel. These blessings carried both encouragements and warnings, reflecting the unique paths each son would take. Jacob's life ended in peace, surrounded by his children and grandchildren, and he was buried in the land God had promised his ancestors. From a boy who clung to his brother's heel, to a man who wrestled with God and received a new name, Jacob's story is one of transformation, faith, and grace. It reminds us that God can use our weaknesses and mistakes to fulfill his great purposes. Like Jacob, we are invited to walk with God, trusting that he transforms our identities and leads us to blessing. Even if the journey is difficult and full of surprises,